Hey there. Welcome to your deep dive into this huge question, does God exist? We're going to be looking at this based on the document you sent, my argument against the existence of God, and also some classic philosophical arguments, that have been around forever.
It's a topic that can feel kind of overwhelming, right?
Hey.
But we're going to break it down, pull out the most interesting parts, and even some surprising counter arguments.
Okay, so first, the arguments for God's existence. There are three main ones. Philosophers have been debating these for ages. The ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the teleological argument.
Yeah, each one comes at the question from a different angle.
Yeah.
But they're all trying to build a case for God using logic and, what we observe about the world.
So first up is the ontological argument, and this one gets a little out there.
Okay.
Okay, imagine the greatest conceivable being. That's basically the definition of God they use here. The argument then says existence is a perfection. So the greatest conceivable being must exist, because a being that exists is greater than a being that doesn't.
It's so wild how they try to just define God into existence just through logic alone. It's been a really influential argument, but it has some pretty big holes.
Yeah, the document uses this really good analogy with Santa Claus. Like, we can picture Santa perfectly, right? Down to his laugh and the reindeer. But that doesn't actually mean he exists.
Yeah.
Just because we can perfectly imagine something doesn't guarantee its existence in the real world.
Right, and the document actually takes it even further. It questions whether existence is always a perfection. Think about it. Things that don't exist aren't limited by natural laws. They can do things that go against physics and logic that existing things can't. So it makes you think maybe non-existence is actually better in some ways.
Okay, that's a real head trip. So now the second big argument, the cosmological argument. This one's all about cause and effect. Everything that starts to exist has to have a cause, right? The universe had a beginning, we know, the Big Bang. Therefore, it must have a cause, and that cause is God.
This one just feels right intuitively because we experience cause and effect all the time. And it kind of lines up with the Big Bang Theory, so it seems kind of scientific too.
But like always, there are counter-arguments. The document says that maybe an infinite chain of causes, they call it an infinite regress, might not be impossible after all. What if we don't understand time correctly? Then there's quantum mechanics, which says that some events, at the subatomic level, happen randomly without a cause.
And even if we accept that the universe does have to have a cause, the document says, why does that cause have to be God specifically? Like the God of traditional religions. Couldn't it be some kind of energy or force or something we haven't even thought of yet?
And that brings us to the classic question. If everything needs a creator, then who created God? If you're saying that God is self-existent, couldn't the universe itself be self-existent?
Good point. And that brings us to the third argument, the teleological argument. This one's all about the order and complexity of the universe, saying it points towards an intelligent designer, God.
The document uses some amazing examples too, like DNA, the human eye, the way the laws of physics seem perfectly set up for life to exist. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, it's like imagine you find a watch just lying on the ground. You wouldn't just assume it assembled itself randomly, right? You'd assume someone made it, a watchmaker. The teleological argument uses that same logic, but with the universe. It says the complexity points to a designer, God.
But of course, there are other ways to explain this. One is evolution by natural selection. It says complex life forms developed over millions of years, through gradual changes and adaptation. No need for a designer there.
And then there's the anthropic principle. This basically says we observe a fine-tuned universe because if it weren't fine-tuned for life, we wouldn't be here to observe it. It's a little tricky, but it says that our very existence might explain why the universe seems so perfect for us.
It's like winning the lottery and being like, whoa, what are the odds? Well, someone had to win, right? So maybe it's not that crazy that our universe is the one that supports life. Then there's the multiverse theory, that maybe there are tons of universes out there, each with different properties. Maybe we just happen to be in the one that works for life.
So you can see, even with these classic arguments for God, there are strong arguments against it too.
Yeah, it's not a simple yes or no question.
Yeah.
Now we're going to shift gears and get into the author's own arguments against the existence of God. This is where it gets really interesting.
So, okay, let's dive into how the author builds their case against God's existence. They start with this thing called the burden of proof.
Okay, burden of proof. What does that even mean here?
Basically, it means whoever's making the claim, in this case, the claim that God exists, they have to give evidence to support it. It's not the skeptic's job to disprove it.
So it's like a courtroom, right?
Yeah.
The prosecutor has to present the evidence to prove the defendant's guilty.
Exactly. The author uses that analogy. You don't have to prove God doesn't exist. It's the believer who has to make a strong case for God.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What's the next part of the author's argument then?
Next, they bring in Occam's razor, a principle you said you liked. It basically says, when you have multiple explanations, the simplest one is usually the best.
Yeah, Occam's razor. I like that one. But, I mean, couldn't you argue that God is a simpler explanation? I mean, even though the idea of God is complex, maybe it answers more questions than science can right now.
That's a really good point. It's a valid counterargument. But the author says natural explanations like evolution, physics, they're enough to explain the universe as we get it now. They say we don't need to add God to make things make sense.
So basically the author's saying, keep it simple. I get how a skeptic would like that.
Yeah.
What else does the author say?
Well, then they get into what they call flawed human reasoning. They're saying our understanding of the universe is limited. We tend to fill in the blanks with our own assumptions and biases.
Like how ancient cultures thought storms and eclipses were caused by gods because they couldn't explain them otherwise.
Exactly. The author sees that all through history. Humans putting human characteristics onto things they don't understand.
And they use all the different religions as an example, right? Like all the conflicting ideas about God. It's like we make up what we believe based on our culture more than any actual truth.
That's a big part of their argument. Okay, next up, they introduce this concept you might have heard of, the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule. Does that ring a bell?
The 80-20 rule? Yeah, isn't that like 80% of your results come from 20% of your efforts? Something like that?
Yep, that's the one. The author's saying we don't have to know everything about the universe to draw some conclusions. They use this cool analogy. Climbing Mount Everest. You don't need to map every inch of the mountain to reach the top.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So they're saying even though our knowledge isn't complete, what we do know is enough to think about whether God exists.
Exactly. They say what we know points to natural laws and processes, not some divine being controlling everything.
So we've got the burden of proof, Occam's razor, flawed human reasoning, and the 80-20 rule. What's the author's final point?
Finally, they come back around to those classic arguments for God, the big three, and say they just don't hold up.
Wait, let me guess. They use those counter-arguments we talked about before.
You got it. They repeat how just defining something like in the ontological argument doesn't mean it's real in the real world.
And they say that the cosmological argument doesn't really prove that the God of religion is the only possible cause for the universe, right?
Right on. There could be other things that explain it. And for the teleological argument, they remind us that evolution and the anthropic principle offer different explanations for why the universe seems designed.
So where does the author end up after all these arguments? Do they have a clear conclusion?
Yeah, they conclude that because there's no real proof for God and because human reasoning can be messed up, non-belief makes the most sense.
And they use those analogies again to make the point, right? The courtroom and Santa Claus. Like, we wouldn't just believe those without evidence, so why should God be any different?
It really makes you think about what you believe and why.
Definitely. We've gone through the classic arguments for God, the counter-arguments, and the author's case against God. It's a lot to absorb, but I think we've broken it down pretty well.
We've covered so much, but we're not done yet. In the last part of this deep dive, we'll give you some extra stuff to think about that might send you in some interesting new directions.
All right, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into the arguments for and against God. We've gone through a lot, from those classic philosophy arguments to the author's own case for not believing.
It's been pretty amazing unpacking all these different ideas and tackling these big questions,
Right. So I want to leave you with one last thought-provoking question. Something to really think about as you keep exploring this topic on your own. Remember how we talked about the cosmological argument and that whole first cause thing?
Yeah, the idea that everything needs a cause to exist. So the universe must have a cause too, and that cause is God.
And the author countered that by saying, what if God can be self-existent? Couldn't the universe also just be self-existent? That really got me thinking.
It really challenges the way we usually think about God. What if the universe just is, without needing anything else to bring it into being?
Exactly. Does the idea of something being self-existent mean it doesn't need a creator at all? If something can just be eternally, doesn't that change how we think about creation and cause and effect?
For sure. It brings up some really deep questions. If the universe is self-existent, then what does that even mean for God? Does it mean a creator isn't even necessary?
Makes you wonder if we've been asking the wrong questions this whole time. Instead of asking who created the universe, maybe we should be asking how. How can something exist without a cause? How can something exist forever?
Those are questions that science and philosophy are still trying to figure out. But I think the author's point about the universe possibly being self-existent opens up a whole new way to think about these mysteries.
It reminds us that we don't have all the answers. And that's okay. The fun part is trying to understand it all. We've only just scratched the surface of this topic. But hopefully, this deep dive helped make those arguments for and against God a little clearer, and maybe gave you some new things to think about.
Totally. And remember, there's so much more to learn. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into all those big mysteries out there.
And keep sending in those thought-provoking documents. We'll be here to help you break them down and explore them. Until next time.